Bonjour, I'm very happy to be with you today. And first of all, thanks to Muriel and Hervé, the RED organizers, and thanks to Laurence and his team and her team behind the camera. I am Jacques Arnould, the ethics advisor of CNES. And what means ethics advisor at CNES? In fact, it's having the opportunity to be with you today and trying to introduce some interrogation concerning the little green man, or more seriously, astrobiology. Astrobiology is not an innocent science. I read a very interesting story concerning primatologists. In the life of a primatologist, a young scientist, it's a real important ordeal at the beginning of his job. It's a time when he must look a monkey face to face and decide whether or not to continue his research. Because he understands that if he continues to trying to know more about primates, he learns more things concerning humankind and especially himself, pleasant or unpleasant. And for me, it's the same for astrobiology. In the life of a young or perhaps older astrobiologist, arrive a time where searching for extraterrestrial life introduce more and more interrogation concerning life on Earth, and perhaps concerning human life and personal life. And we have to decide to go forward or not. And ethics in astrobiology is the origin and the consequence of this situation. First, we have to begin before the space age. Before the space age, the official and common way to name extraterrestrial life or astrobiology was another expression, plurality of worlds. And plurality of worlds was, in fact, different question. First question is a philosophical question. Albertus Magnus, a philosopher of the Middle Age, explains that this question of plurality of worlds is one of the most marvelous and noble questions in nature. In fact, behind the question of the existence or inexistence of other worlds and perhaps other form of life, behind this in the existence or inexistence were different philosophical conception of the reality. If you have the idea of a unique world, of life only on Earth, in fact, this view is coherent with a cosmic vision of the reality. What I mean by cosmic vision is the fact that you are existing in a cosmos, and cosmos is a perfect, organized, and determined reality, without contingency, without chaos. And in the center of this cosmos, you have Earth, and on Earth, human life, and perhaps other form of life. This view was the most classic view, not only in Greek philosophy, but also in the Occidental philosophy during a long time. The father of this view was Aristotle. Another way to think was being ready to have other form of life on other planets, other worlds, a plurality of worlds. And in this case, this conception, this cosmological conception, is linked with the possibility of contingency, of chaos. A very nice summary of this situation and the controversy was given during the Middle Age by Thomas Aquinas. He explains that only those who don't recognize any orderly wisdom, but who believe in chance, can assert the existence of several worlds, like Democritus, who said that this world, alongside countless other worlds, was a product of a chance encounter of atoms. Democritus was an atomist, philosopher. You can understand that at this time and until the modern time, plurality of worlds was a very debated philosophical question, not directly scientific question. This question was also a theological question. Only a very brief time concerning this point. And the question was very easy. Can the divinity, can God create other intelligence beings than humans, especially than me? In fact, geocentrism, remember the Copernican revolution. Geocentrism and anthropocentrism are linked. Some of us, some of our ancestors, have real difficulty to admit the idea not being unique. I give the name of this difficulty the name of elder syndrome. We can prefer to be the unique child of our parents. The arrival of a little brother or little sister is a real catastrophe. And it was the idea of most of theological tradition, linked with this elder syndrome. We are unique children of our divine parents, divine Father. On the contrary, if we are accepting the idea of other brother and sister, perhaps this idea of plurality influence our self-awareness and perhaps our ethics. After being a philosophical and a theological question, the question of plurality of words is also a scientific question. I mean science in the sense of all time. I gave in one of the previous picture the cover of a book of Fontenelle. Fontenelle is a French scientist and philosopher. And he wrote a very interesting book concerning the conversation about the plurality of words. Fontenelle was not only the writer, he was also a scientist, and he was the perpetual secretary of the Academy of Science in Paris at the beginning of the 17th century. And it's very interesting. It means that this question of plurality of words was at this time, or began at this time, to be a scientific question, but without concrete observation and only very far astronomical observation. But the same Academy of Science in Paris, now at the end of the 19th century, created a prize to encourage communication with extraterrestrial societies. Very interesting, because the Moon and Mars was outside this prize, outside this challenge, because at this time it was very clear that it would be easy to communicate with people on the Moon and on Mars. It was not a scientific position, but a position linked with a scientific organization. Plurality of words was also a scientific question at the same time with the famous affair of the Mars CANALS and Percival Lowell and observation of this very strange figure on Mars of the red planets. Everybody knows this debate. It was perhaps more an epistemological question than a scientific question. What is the difference between the reality and what we observe of the reality? It's probably the main lesson of this debate at the end of the 19th century concerning the canals of Mars. After being a philosophical, theological, and scientific question, plurality of world is also a question or a main subject for literary and science fiction. You have so many examples before the space age, and perhaps the main example is the War of Worlds, written by Wells at the end of the 19th century, at the same time as the prize created by the Academy of Science in Paris. But after that, and you know, during the space age, and I arrive at this time, you have so many examples of science fiction books and creation. Only two examples, Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton or Mars Trilogy, linked with some ethical question. So it was before the space age, and we have to arrive at the space age by the famous Sputnik launch. It could be a very, in the agenda, a very good time to introduce the space age. And with this time, we have a modification, an evolution. We don't speak today about the plurality of worlds, inhabited or not. We are speaking about exobiology and astrobiology. One of the most interesting writers in history of science, Stephen Dick, explained that exobiology don't exist either in name or substance before the dawn of the space age, and that's correct. At the same time, you can use the denomination you want, exobiology, astrobiology, or even plurality of worlds. We have to recognize that this question is probably the last avatar of a very old question of the other. Who, where, which is the possible other of my own, different of me, different of our human species. It's a very, very old question. Sometimes I explain that this question of the other, of the alien, of the alter ego perhaps, is not only one of the most old question, but this question follows us as our shadow. We cannot avoid this question every day, everywhere. And exobiology, astrobiology give us the opportunity one more time to ask this question and perhaps trying to provide some answers. It's really a question linked with exploration. When we explore, we have to go outside our own personality, our own identity, our own common territory, and it's exploration, it's the occasion perhaps to go to encounter other people from our species, other life, other form of life, and perhaps in the future extraterrestrial life. So it's a very interesting philosophical question. But this question is very specific. Everybody knows it's a very famous sentence, perhaps for Martin Rees, the British astronomer, or perhaps from Carl Sagan, I don't know. I have the two possibilities. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And by this sentence, we are introduced in the specificity of this question. Until now, after 60 or perhaps more years of research in official exobiology and astrobiology, we don't have any clear evidence of the existence of other form of life or form of life on other planets around us. It's open. We have a lot of data, a lot of hypotheses. We can calculate probabilities, and you are able now to do that with people around you in the astrobiological domain. But in fact, until now, the only issue is to have a positive answer. We are hoping to have that in the nearest future. We are waiting on this positive answer. But we never obtain a definitive negative answer. That's a very specific situation of the astrobiological question. So we have to remain until now open to a positive answer, and to know that we never had the negative. It's a very interesting situation, and we are not very perhaps ready to admit that. Okay, we will see in the future. Connected with this question, with this domain of astrobiology, we have a lot of very interesting philosophical questions. You know every of these questions. First, what is life? It's a scientific question, but not only a scientific question, it's also a philosophical question. Perhaps remember the sentence of Albertus Magnus, one of the most marvelous and noble and difficult question in the nature and concerning nature. What is life? Try to offer your own answer to that. Related with what is life is what is the value of life? And in our topic of astrobiology, we have some very specific questions. For example, and I try to answer or to give some answer further, how far can we go in the research for knowledge concerning another life when the existence of the researcher, of the explorer, and perhaps of all humankind is in danger? Another question is, can we colonize a planet on which we would have discovered traces of life, alien life, present or even past? Other philosophical question is it possible to establish principles, moral, ethics, when we are in situation of ignorance? And at least is a question of relativism. We can organize, elaborate human ethics, but what is concerning alien ethics? We know that we have different ways to evaluate life, the quality of life, and I give some example of this view. But if you introduce the possibility of alien life, it's more complicated. Okay, but now the story is that 9 months, and we are introducing a very interesting, it's the first, how planetary protection was introduced. And it was by moon dust. 9 months after the Sputnik flight, two American scientists, Joshua Lederberg and Dean Cowie, published an article, Moon Dust, in which they alert scientists about the danger of contamination. At this time, just in 1958, researching the origin of life was the new world, the new frontier. And at this time, even moon dust could provide some priceless secrets. So sending rockets on the moon, on the surface of the moon, means mechanical, physical, chemical, and perhaps biological contamination. And by this way, destroying perhaps some very precious data. And it's what we name today forward contamination, you know that. And it was necessary to avoid that in the name of the future science and the future astrobiological science. And the impact of this article was great, and especially the young NASA. And NASA decided to introduce rules, procedures concerning planetary protection. It was the birth of what we name today planetary protection, and connect with that officer or planetary protection officer. It's very interesting because moon dust remain at the always interesting 10 years after at the during the Apollo mission, and you know that at this time the question of contamination was always very important for the NASA teams, and the Apollo crew coming back from the moon 11, 12 and 14 mission were in quarantine due to contamination. Forward contamination, but backward contamination also. How to protect man, but also moon rocks from contamination. So another way to illustrate the fact that moon dust was at the center of the interest at this time. Now it's no more the case, because after some research we know that it was no risk of backward contamination, and only the stones have to be protected. Another example of this time, I suppose it's very famous among you, is the Surveyor 3 case, and this time during which people think that perhaps we are bring back to Earth some life being after they journeyed to the moon, on the moon, and back to Earth. But it was more a sort of dirty little secret, as named one of the planetary protection officer from NASA, due to a lack of protection in some NASA lab. But by this example, we can introduce some very interesting principle and idea concerning planetary protection. First, to preserve the scientific integrity, we have to introduce what we name in other domain precautionary principle. Perhaps you know that this precautionary principle was introduced now 30 years ago during the Rio de Janeiro conference, and one of the definitions of this principle is the following: where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. And it's a very interesting principle for us in astrobiology. I'm not debating the question of the application of this principle on Earth, and you know that there's a lot of debate around this precautionary principle. But for astrobiology, it's very, very interesting, because we are in a domain of research. So we have to manage ignorance. We have to manage this lack of full scientific certainty. And how to manage that? We have to avoid the contamination of extraterrestrial environment, extraterrestrial samples. It's more concerning forward contamination, but also Earth, also our human species is backward contamination. So we have to apply this precautionary principle without hesitation. And it's probably, in my opinion, something belonging to the astrobiological research, and how to manage that by ethical attitude or position. Precautionary principle, but also another principle, responsibility principle. This principle was introduced by a German philosopher, JONAS, during the 19th, and again, the definition given by JONAS himself is very interesting. act so that the effect of your action are compatible with the permanence of an authentic human life on Earth. This principle is probably more for us linked with backward contamination. But we have a lot of examples, or a lot, but probably not until now, but example now and in the future, where we have to think about this principle. Remember the Genesis mission a few years ago, and they are not catastrophic, but accidental return to Earth. And in this case, there was no damage for life on Earth, but in case of little green men were on board of this probe, it could be perhaps dangerous. Remember the Michael Crichton essay I mentioned before. So responsibility principle is for me another very interesting principle for ethical reflection in astrobiology. And a very good example of the application of these two principles when we are going to Mars and beyond is the recommendation elaborated by COSPAR, the international organization. And in this recommendation, COSPAR proposed a global protection, especially in case of forward contamination, how to manage our exploration mission to protect the extraterrestrial environment linked with the level of knowledge or the level of ignorance we have concerning this extraterrestrial context, planet or other environment. But all these recommendations are very interesting. You know this recommendation, you are probably working with them. But at the same time, we have to admit that it's not enough. It's not enough to manage the future, especially because we are in a situation of a lack of knowledge, a situation of ignorance, and how to manage especially the risk in the future. One way to trying to think about the future is to ask the following question. Will astronauts be regarded as samples? It's until now example, because remember the case of Apollo mission, there's no real risk, and the management was good at this time, I mean with a possible contamination. But in the case of future mission on other planets, yes, we can have the situation of contamination of the astronaut. Sure that the exploration, as I mentioned before, exploration going outside our common way of life, our common domain of life, is always risky. But in the case of astrobiology, we have a very specific situation. In the case of contamination of astronaut, and we know today this situation of contamination in our pandemic situation, when you are contaminated, you became immediately, or after a few time, contaminating agent. From contaminated to contaminating. And that's a challenge. And it's connecting with what we name forward or backward contamination. It's not easy. It's never easy to break the chain of contamination in general, but especially in our situation of, I use this example of astronauts, because it's human being. And if you ask engineer, they explain you all the situation in the exploration mission and arriving on Mars, on other planets, and how it's quite impossible to avoid that, and to avoid the situation of from being contaminated to becoming contaminating. And so the question is real. I mean, we have to ask this question when we are preparing mission in the future. And in this case, we have to, the first question is how we have to consider astronauts, contaminated and contaminating astronauts. I have no time to introduce at this time the question of the legal status of astronaut. You know that officially and legally, astronaut are envoys, messenger of humankind. That's the official position. Okay, but in case of contamination, you have not to ignore that, but you have to introduce this official position in a very concrete situation of contamination. And what we can do, what we can decide for this astronaut, how first to evaluate the risk, how to, what sort of procedure we have to introduce before contamination. I mean, for example, when they come back to Earth, what sort of procedures, what sort of analysis, measure, and what sort of decision. In fact, we don't have until now very concrete idea. We can elaborate precise observation, we can prepare quarantine, we can perhaps prepare some sort of vaccination, and in case of contamination, what's the future? It's not an easy question. If we have the idea of a high level of risk, and even if we don't have a very concrete idea, what is the danger? It's a question of responsibility, even if they are volunteer to be explored, to go to another planet, but we have a responsibility concerning this explorer. We have a responsibility not only concerning this astronaut, but the connection between this astronaut and our humankind. And it's not only a question of individual situation, but a global situation. And we know that we are not until now really ready to find, to decide, to answer, to give a concrete decision. But it's a very interesting situation, and I hope that in the future we have concrete debate concerning that. And perhaps after this period of pandemic, we have new idea concerning the relation between individual situation, between the individual person and the society, the collective dimension. We can wait perhaps several months and introduce that. It could be very, very interesting. But again, I repeat, what sort of measure we can introduce to detect, to assess, to manage the risk, and what sort of procedure we can introduce as solution, vaccination, quarantine, or perhaps in a very bad situation, form of euthanasia. We know that's how, and at this situation, how we can combine a context of very lethal or bad situation and a situation of urgency, and the free consent of people. A very a huge question, but by this way, and we have by this way we have to remember the story of humankind, the story of exploration, the story of colonization, the story of the discovery of the new world a few centuries ago, and the consequence for the people in the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Not easy, but remember what we know or perhaps what we ignore concerning this time, perhaps we have another but the same chapter in the future. And we have probably to prepare that in the same time we're preparing the scientific exploration of our cosmos and our, especially our astrobiological mission. But zero risk don't exist, never forget that. And especially when we are trying to explore the unknown. Remember, I asked two sort of questions at the beginning of my talk, and one of the questions was concerning the colonization of other planets. I know that it's not directly linked with astrobiology, but in the head of our of people around us, it's a real connection. And it's what sort of attitude we have to elaborate and to decide when we discover a form of life, present or past, in another or on another planet. And remember what we can read on Earth during the first mission to Mars during the 60s and 70s. It's very interesting, especially the difference between red and green. At this time, the red opinion was protection of Mars. If we find some trace of life on Mars, I repeat, present or past, we have to sanctuarize Mars. It was a red attitude because Mars has to stay red. Life is sacred, and we have to sanctuarize Mars or another planet. The green position was the opposite position. Okay, perhaps it was life on Mars in the past or now, but we are arriving the first. Martian life don't arrive first on Earth, so we can colonize Mars. And it's a green position because arriving with our not only automatic probe but with our human crew, it's a way to green Mars. It's more a sort of, yes, perhaps life is sacred, but struggle for life is the rules, the Darwinian rules. So, okay, we can go and colonize our life on Mars. It was the debate 40 years ago. Today, perhaps our attitude could be a little different. A few years ago, NASA scientists published a very interesting essay or article named Ethical Exploration and the Role of Planetary Protection in Disrupting Colonial Practices. So probably the green attitude was a more colonial attitude, okay, but it's how to think differently. It's a very interesting study. So we have to think about that. What sort of attitude we decide to promote concerning an hypothetical life on Mars or beyond Mars. Again, we don't have definitive and official position, but don't forget the very interesting legal principle introduced by the Space Treaty 50 years ago. This idea of common heritage of mankind. You probably know this principle, this legal principle. It's a very interesting principle. Normally, we said, okay, common heritage of mankind means a sort of appropriation, heritage of mankind. And some people say it's totally stupid. What sort of hubris coming from humankind saying space is our common heritage. You can interpret this principle by this way. And in this case, it's a very anthropocentric and incredible excessive pretension. But my interpretation of this legal principle is more linked with the responsibility principle. Remember, for Jonas, this principle was linked with human life on Earth, but we can apply this principle, responsibility principle, on another planet. And when we say by the space treaty that space is our common heritage, we don't say that it's our it's not a way to appropriate space. Space is not our property, but space is our responsibility. We don't know if extraterrestrial life exists or not, but by introducing this principle of common heritage, for me, we are deciding or we are accepting that space we explore, space we discover, is under our responsibility. And we have to manage our decision, our attitude, our action with a real interest and a real therefore responsibility. And remember, Jonas was linked how to protect life and human life on Earth. It could be how to protect reasonably life on other planets. So that's a way we have now to probably to think, to prepare the future of exploration. Because exobiology, or astrobiology as you want, it's a good occasion, a very nice opportunity to reignite the essence of exploration. I mentioned that at the beginning of my talk. Exploration belongs to our human essence, going outside our identity, our frontiers, our knowledge, our certainties, and okay, exploration, it's my opinion, belongs to our essence. And astrobiology, trying to find other form of life, perhaps intelligent life, it's an incredible opportunity to promote this spirit of exploration. So it's not only a scientific issue, it's not only a technical issue, it's also an incredible, interesting philosophical opportunity. When I began my work as ethics advisor in CNES, I tried to find some previous work in this domain. I don't find a lot of books. And one of these books was very, very interesting. It was an essay written by a German philosopher in 1960, just at the beginning of the space age. And the title of this book was Is the Sky Open to Us? Is the Sky Open to Us? An open question, just at the beginning of the space age. And this philosopher was not pro or against the space exploration. He tried to think about what is the consequence for Earth coming from space exploration, and what is the condition to explore space. And he reintroduced a very old sentence coming from Socrates. Know yourself. And after you discover the world around you and perhaps other form of life. And I think that's the first consequence and concrete consequence today of astrobiology on philosophy and ethics is the necessity to know better and better concerning our own human condition. And that's the reason astrobiology it's so fascinating. It's a fascinating domain. And astrobiology fascinates people perhaps probably you, but also people around us. Because it's always the occasion to think about myself, who I am, where I decide to be. It's not easy, because you always arrive at very sensitive question. Remember my question, what we have to do if tomorrow astronauts became contaminated and contaminating agent for us? We decide to kill them, or what? We don't have answer. But I know that trying to give some answer to this sort of question is a way to progress in our own humankind. That's the reason we have to go forward in astrobiological research. And that's the reason you are today at the RED session. Thank you for your attention.